Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Philosophy of in Eastern Europe podcast brought to you by the European Center for Philosophy of Culture. We would like to re-examine Eastern Europe from a philosophical perspective.
One can say that, given the current geopolitical and geocultural circumstances, this question was never more important than it is now. So, what is Eastern Europe? Where is it located? What are its distinctive axiological and normative characteristics? What is its significance for the European cultural project?
Ukraine occupies a very special space within Eastern Europe, a space where many of its paradoxes and tensions, its cultural richness and historical misfortunes are most clearly visible. It is a space of cultural polyphony, plurality, and hybridity. Thus, Ukraine is in a sense at the heart of our attempts at positive reconceptualization of Eastern Europe. Needless to say that the outstanding, spectacular resilience and resoluteness of Ukrainian people confronted with the barbarian Russian aggression was a direct source of inspiration for reawakening of the question of Eastern Europe. No longer experienced only as a curse or a stigma, but rather as a positive constellation of experiences constituting a specific ethos. Our guest today is Professor Volodymyr Yermolenko, philosopher, writer, academic teacher, the current president of the Ukrainian Pen Club. Hello, Volodymyr.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And we are going to talk about Ukraine's political, or more broadly, cultural identity. So let me start with the first question, which seems to be obvious, but doesn't have to be. It seems that one of the interesting or fruitful ways to think about Ukraine as a country, as the people, as the constellation of experiences, is to do it through metaphors, where there are many metaphors by means of which one can speak about Ukraine, the gates of Europe, which is the title of the very, at least in my opinion, very good historical book by Serhii Plokhy, steppe or a steppe versus forest. But even the very name Ukraine is already a kind of a spatial metaphor. A metaphor whose general meaning can be more or less clear for the people, for the educated people from the region, but I believe it doesn't have to be clear for the worldwide audience. What is implied by that name? What layers of meaning can be identified in it? Why this very name is so important?
First, Przemek, let me thank you very much for the invitation and for the huge solidarity that I feel in your work, and say thank you for your words today on the conference and for organizing the conference today. I'm very actually glad and honored to be in Poland because I consider that our destinies are really interlinked and we should really consider them together. So Ukraine, the word Ukraine there is a debate between Ukrainians what it actually means, because there is this meaning that Ukraine means the frontier, the borderlands. But Ukraine also can mean Krajina. So in Krajina in Ukrainian means a country. So you can actually say that this is the name of the country. And some other people say that, okay, but there is the word kraj, which means kraj, as I think in Polish it's also very similar. Kraj means a country, but also kraj means a borderland of the country, a frontier of the country. And you can say, okay, if you think about this, then Ukraine and Krajina, that means some land that has clear-cut borders. And the question is, whether Ukraine means a borderland, a border between something and something, or it means a country which draws its borders itself. So it's a kind of a the discussion about this, and I would say that the Russian propaganda mostly wants us to believe that Ukraine is just a border between something and something, while we, of course, in Ukraine tend to say that we are, this is our land, we draw the borders ourselves, and we do not let anybody else to cross these borders. The another meaning is that, is borderland a good metaphor for understanding what Ukraine is? And I remember your great poet Adam Mickiewicz, who was making his great class in Paris, in Collège de France, in I think it was 1840s, and he was describing Ukraine as a place where, as he said, all the armies of the world meet. And it's a place between Europe and Asia. And if you think about this metaphor, he already probably meant at the time what Timothy Snyder meant 100 years afterwards, 150 years afterwards, by his metaphor of bloodlands. So obviously, Ukraine is a place where there is a lot of movement, and Ukraine is a country where all these great migrations of people that ended in Europe at some time continued throughout the modern ages, continued throughout the modernity, through the 19th century, through the 20th century. And it creates this image, this reality of Ukraine, which at the same time is full of these encounters, but these encounters are not always the peaceful ones. What we are trying to do, I think, in today's Ukraine is to understand how we can bring these encounters to some very fruitful and interesting and rich culture. For example, we are very now interested in the way how Polish culture, Polish-speaking culture was important for Ukrainians during the Baroque times, during the 19th century, during the 20th century even. How the Jewish culture was important, how the Muslim culture is important, how the Greek culture is important for us. So I would see this reality of Ukraine in this way.
Let me move to the second question then. What seem to be characteristics for Ukraine throughout its history and for its cultural identity was a series of dualisms, which in different phases of its history took on different forms and different degree of intensity. So it's this famous opposition between the heart and reason, or dualism of heart and reason, civil society versus the political, West and East, and one of your favorite dualisms, roots versus uprootedness. Was this image adequate, and even more importantly, is it still adequate?
Well, I think every culture is based upon plurality. You can say dualism or trialism or other principles. No culture is based upon one single principle. So it's always a connection, and it's the way how you put this connection together. For example, in my thinking, it's very important to think about the roots and the idea that Ukrainians are like. Ukrainians love this, but what I call botanic anthropology, meaning that people are also like plants and having roots very deep, and you cannot uproot them very quickly. But at the same time, of course, Ukraine presupposes the idea of a steppe, which is much more porous and much more migratory, much more nomadic. And for example, if you take the Cossacks of the early modern times, the early modern warriors, who are they? They are settled or they are nomadic? I would say that they are both, and they kind of combine these both sides of the culture. They can be nomadic and they can be settled at the same time. And take another example, which I think is egalitarianism or aristocratism. it's true that, for example, it's interesting how Polish and Ukrainian culture communicate in this way, because I'm really interested in this, what was happening in the Polish Romanticism, in this Chlopomany, and all these people like Zaleski and others who were really interested, or Tchaikovsky, not the composer, but another Tchaikovsky, the writer and the intellectual, who had a very, I think, Witold Tchaikovsky. So the interest to that grassroots culture that Ukraine has. And in the 19th century, it was the big interest both in Poland and in Russia and in Ukraine itself. What do we do with this oral culture, peasant culture, the national traditions? Ukrainians, when we were looking at Poland in the 19th century, we were fascinated by this aristocratic element, by this a little bit Szlachta element, right? And probably we also lack this element a little bit, and therefore one of our major thinkers, political thinkers, Wieczysław Lipinski, has Polish origins, and I think
Wacław Lipinski.
Yes.
Initially.
Yes. So we call it Wieczysław Lipinski. You call it Wacław Lipinski. He wrote many of his texts in Polish, but he was also arguing for Ukraine. So in a way, he was kind of telling the Poles the story of Ukraine, but in Ukraine, he was trying to give Ukrainians more this aristocratic element and more this vertical element of vertical power that will compensate this anarchic horizontality of the Ukrainian political nation. So I think it's always an interesting how you combine it. For example, okay, take religion, right? We are, that Orthodox religion plays a huge role, but Ukraine would not have been possible without dialogue and also confrontation with Polish Catholicism. So we have a mixture, an attempt to bring these things together and create the Greco-Catholic Church or Uniat Church, which was perceived by many Ukrainians at that time as a hostile church. But then in the 19th and 20th century, it was one of the symbols of the Ukrainian identity and still is. And I come from Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, so it's 17th century. It's the first university, one of the first universities in our region, and it's impossible to think about Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and this intellectual spirit without learning from Polish Catholics and confronting the Polish Catholics, right? So it's the two, and therefore, it's very interesting.
Returning in a form of a follow-up question to this split or a tension between West and East, because I believe Ukraine for a very long time, and unfortunately in the West still is considered to be Eastern, purely Eastern, in a sense of belonging to the Russian sphere of influence. And this is this grave danger for Ukrainian sovereignty. I hope not I hope, but I believe that you know that much better than I do, how long the collective West was thinking about how to react to this war, because come on, Ukraine is still a part of Russia's influence.
Well, it's amazing how the West's look into the Eastern Europe is very short-sighted and short-term. I don't know how you perceive that in Poland, but basically, people in the West are very often framed by the story which is told by the Russian historiography in the 19th century. And in this Russian historiography, everything that preceded this history is kind of non-existent. But Ukrainian history is much deeper. If you are very cautious, you should go with Ukrainian history back to the Rus of Kyiv, which was 10th, 9th, and 10th century. And if you compare the centuries when Ukraine was under the Russian influence, Galicia was only half a century. In the 20th century, the left bank Ukraine, meaning the eastern part, was mostly since the early 18th century, maybe, and right bank Ukraine, which was under Polish influence for many centuries, many times, was under Russian influence only after partitions of Poland, meaning the late 18th century. So it's very tiny period of time. But actually, Ukrainian history doesn't start in medieval times in Rus. You can say, okay, so what about the Scythians, of which Herodotus is talking, and the Black Sea culture? What about the kingdom of Bospor? What about the Genovese in Crimea? What about Kukut and Tripilla culture, which goes to the 6th millennium, or 4th millennium before Christ? And of course, I mean, it's interesting to talk about this, and it's important to talk about this. You cannot talk about the history of France only from the French Revolution. You always go deeper into the Middle Times and Middle Ages. Somehow, I don't know why, but when people talk about Eastern Europe, they are much more short-sighted. But at the same time, you talk about East and West, and I started talking about, but if we go deeper into times, much more important is the axis north-south. And you can read Ukrainian history, medieval history, as the connection between the Vikings from the north and the Greeks, or the Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire from the south. You can read the Greek history in the Black Sea region as a kind of a moving the Greek to the south. I always say in Europe that, look, Black Sea was much more densely colonized by the Greeks in 7th or 6th century before Christ than the Mediterranean. So the first Greek colonies on the current Ukrainian territory, it's the city called Olbia and the city called Tira, were in the 7th century before Christ, while the first colony in France was Marseille. It was 6th century before Christ. So it's very interesting, very interestingly connected, and I'm very kind of I like to think about these layers of history, which is, of course, cannot be described if you have only this imperial Russian vision of history, that it's all about the Russian state.
I think this leads us to the next question, to the question about history itself. So one of your colleagues, Andrei Bondar, wrote once that Ukraine exists not thanks to history or in the history, but rather despite the history or on its margins. Given the dramatic history of Ukraine, it is very difficult not to agree with that. On the other hand, if one realizes that it assumes a lack of political subjecthood, because I see it as a clear implication of such a statement, a lack of ethical substance, such an ascription provokes an immediate objection. Since how can this be applied to a nation, to the people whose origin lie at least in the very first in the world world history, truly anti-colonialist war? And here I mean obviously Khmelnytsky's uprising, or as you call it in Ukraine very often, national liberation war. Or a nation which played a pivotal role in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Or to the nation which responded so resolutely during the revolution of the Euromaidan to initial efforts of Yanukovych to restore stronger ties with Russia. So, what constitutes, to think philosophically about it, what constitutes the core of specifically Ukrainian historical experience?
That's a very interesting question, and the Andrei Bondar idea that you described is very, very interesting. I love this concept of despite. It's also the concept of my thinking in many aspects. I think today we're going through this experience of despite life, despite death, and culture despite barbarity. But I think one of the key questions is the question of state. So Ukrainians, for somehow, were either internally unable or externally prevented from having a state. And this is why, for example, this thinking about the state and the need to get a state is one of the leitmotifs of the 20th and 21st century. And you cannot survive as a people without a state. And I think Polish example, Polish experience of the 19th century is really, very, very clear about that. And we have lots of parallels. I mean, it's obvious example, compare our national anthems. And these were born yours in the late 18th century, ours in the mid 19th century, the words, but they are kind of the same. This story about that your nation is almost dead, but it actually is not dead. It will regenerate, and this belief and this trust in this regeneration, I think it's you talk about our common ethos between Poles and Ukrainians, and there is a lot of this feeling as well that our nation, despite all the suffering and despite hopelessness, maybe hasn't died and will regenerate, and this is what happened. So I think this kind of a regenerative idea was very, very, very important. But I think also that the leitmotif of Ukrainian history is this horizontal character of society. And this helped us because during the times of oppression, its horizontal character helped us to preserve our identity. So if you think how many kind of sufferings the Ukrainians experienced when we tried to preserve this identity in the 18th century, 19th and 20th century. I mean, Ukrainian dissidents were always receiving high sentences, 10-year-old, 12-year-old in the Soviet Union for just being Ukrainian. How, for example, through the whole practices of erasing and banning Ukrainian language and culture in the 19th century, it's still preserved. I think it's because of this horizontal nature that even when Ukrainians were totally oppressed and colonized by the Russian Empire, we still preserved it. But then this horizontality kind of prevented us from building a state because it's too anarchic spirit. And I think one of the reasons of us losing independence, the first independence in the early 20th century, was of course that Russians immediately, the Bolshevik Russia was immediately turned into a very aggressive and very oppressive empire. And just looked what they did in Kyiv in early 1918 when it was a true genocide and massacre. But at the same time, this anarchic element in the Ukrainian society as well, this what we call Otamanshina, meaning the plurality of different warlords and political leaders. So I think these two elements which are fighting with each other, and even in today's war, you can see that it's also a struggle of two systems. Russian system is very centralized, very vertical, and Ukrainian system is very decentralized. When Russians produce a drone, they produce a drone and then scale it up and produce thousands of the same drones. When Ukrainians produce a drone, you have dozens of different small enterprises who produce dozens of different drones. So the question is, whose system will win? But our system will be always like that. We will not have this tyrannical system. And I think this is in good and bad things about our history, because I think one of the problems of our history is very often we have this uncontrolled violence, which is coming also as a result of maybe often as a result of oppression, but it becomes nasty and becomes uncontrolled. You mentioned Khmelnytsky, who is obviously a Ukrainian kind of a big figure, but I, for example, think about the bad things that he did to the Poles, to the Jews, for example. And I think it's also one of the things to approach our uprising in the 18th century, which were also very bloody, and the question of Volyn, which I think is a question that goes very. Ukrainians have one discourse, Poles have another discourse, but we need really to think very carefully and to understand where does this violence come from, where does Ukrainian violence come from, where does Polish violence come from. and think about this together.
Yeah, absolutely agree, and I'm really happy you raised this issue. I spoke at today's conference that there are clear shortcomings. So we obviously accuse, we Poles, or the public opinion in Poles accuse one-sidedly, excuse me, Ukrainian people of this massacre, but there is no clear sign of reflection about the origins of that. There is no clear signs of reflection that this tragic events, this as we call it, the Volhynia or Wołyń massacre, didn't appear out of the blue. I remember a very interesting thesis made by one of, in my view at least, one of your best historians, Jarosław Hrycaj, who said something very, very simple, but not many people think about it, that Ukrainian nationalism was educated precisely on a Polish nationalism, who preceded Ukrainian nationalism. So even without going into details such as, the very low level of Ukrainian citizens of the Second Rzeczypospolita, even without going into these details, there is something which we should think about it. I mean, this connection and this interrelation between two forms of nationalism.
Yeah, and I think what I said also today in colloquium, no nation is innocent. You cannot say
Absolutely.
that one nation is cruel and another is innocent. We should think about when you have this outburst of violence. And I think Hrycaj shows it very well in his latest book, Global History of Ukraine, because he talks about this chain of violence. So we were living at the time, I think, between starting from the beginning of the First World War until the end of the Second World War. Well, you have this chain of violence which provokes another chain of violence. And you cannot say, okay, but there was a pacification in Poland, and therefore there was a Volyn massacre, and therefore it's the fault of the Poles. No, you cannot say that. It's the fault, and I as a Ukrainian, I cannot remove, and I should not remove the responsibility of Ukrainians for violence in Volyn. But at the same time, I think you are right that Poles also need to think about those reasons, those causes that led to this. Yeah.
Staying with history, I really like this. The so-called beginning of Ukrainian national, so to speak, literature. As I believe, half ironic work by or reworking of the Virgil's Aeneida by Ivan Kotlярewski. And I would like you to say a couple of words about that, because this is every single group of people has some kind of foundational story or foundational narrative. But this narrative is, in many senses, special. First, because it is not dogmatic, but rather half-ironic at least. And second, it speaks not so much about, in my interpretation at least, not so much about going from no longer existing place to the place which exists, but rather going from the place which no longer exists to the place which is, I don't know how to say, imagined?
That's very interesting, because Kotlярewski, to our listeners, is a person at the end of the 18th
Sorry, just one comment for our audience. That was the very first book written in a purely Ukrainian language,
in
correct?
vernacular. In vernacular.
Vernacular.
Because we can say that there is old Ukrainian and or older versions of the Eastern Slavic language,
yeah.
right? And I would not start the Ukrainian literature from that, because many wise people in Ukraine would say that Well, Kotlяревsky is the beginning of something, the beginning of literature in Ukraine in vernacular, or that means of the language of the like ordinary people. But at the same time, you can read him as the end of something, and this end of something is that the educated, latent educated Ukrainian elite, which was directly related to the facts that we were speaking about, this Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, orthodox theology, but in Latin, under the influences of the Poles and Jesuits, but with a big confrontation with them. So it produced the elite that spoke Latin and spoke Greek, and which, for example, Muscovy didn't have. So the first translator of Homer into Russian was a man called Hnidych, and he was from Poltava region, because in Moscow you wouldn't have the translators from the Greek or Latin, and therefore it's very very interesting. But at the same time, during the Baroque times, we had our literature in Polish, because you need to be polemical with the Polish Catholicism, and therefore people were writing sometimes in Polish. Or we had literature by the Poles in Latin, like Sebastian Klinowicz and his Roxolania, which is a very beautiful and also Virgil-type poem about Ukraine. So there are lots of interesting mixtures, and Kotlяревsky takes this culture and mocks it a little bit. And Virgil's Aeneid was, of course, very well known in Ukraine. But I think it's very interesting to read this poem as a deconstruction of the imperial myth, because Aeneid in Virgil, it was what it was. It was the poem asked by Augustus basically to write the deeper history of Rome, which would compete with the Greeks and compete with Homer. But it was a history not of the winners of the Trojan War, but of the losers of the Trojan War that take revenge for their loss, because the idea was, this is Aeneas. He goes through the same or similar, voyage as Odysseus. Odysseus is the founder of Greek mythology, Greek idea, and Aeneas founds Rome, and then Romans are stronger than Greeks. They conquer Greeks. So it was an attempt in Virgil's mind to kind of make the power structure upside down. But Kotlяревsky goes it farther, and he says, no, I'm writing this story not as a foundation of an empire, but rather I'm mocking this empire, mocking this imperial myth, and mocking probably the Russian Empire of the time. It's interesting. Another interesting story is that Troy and Trojan War was kind of very often the topos of the Ukrainian literature. So, for example, you have, after Kotlяревsky, you have, and of course, Kotlяревsky writes this after the destruction of Sich, of the Cossacks, the last siege, which was...
It was, he published this in 1790, correct?
90-something, 98, I think, but the siege was...
17 something.
70,
not 19.
So in
because you said 19.
No, 1798, I think.
Okay.
The very late 18th century, and the siege, the Cossack siege, was destroyed by Catherine II in, if I'm not mistaken, 1775.
Something like that.
While this is important, because, and this is also part of our common history, because the first division of Poland, the first annexation of Crimean Khanate and destruction of the Crimean statehood, and the final destruction of the Ukrainian Cossack autonomy was made by Catherine II in a matter of 3 years.
Yeah, exactly.
1770s. So you see how our stories are connected, and therefore I always say to the Poles and in Poland that I try to explain how Ukrainian idea was also so much connected with the Polish history. You mentioned Rzeczpospolita, but I am also saying about these Baroque times. But the divisions of Ukraine, the divisions of Poland always preceded by the divisions of Ukraine. So if Ukraine could preserve its independence in the 18th century, or if we did succeed to create the union of three nations, as you mentioned, during the union of Hadach or Hadach, probably Poland would not have been divided by
I
three
fully
powers
agree.
in the late 18th century.
I'm inclined to agree with you.
And
Yeah.
the same in the 20th century. So if Ukraine succeeded to preserve its independence, maybe for Stalin it would be much more difficult to invade Poland, because it would have been Ukraine in between, right? Therefore, I really hope that Poles understand that maintaining Ukrainian sovereignty today is the key for the Polish sovereignty.
Well, I believe that even though, as we spoke today, there is some kind of significant decrease of uncritical and full support for Ukraine, I believe that those who understand that still prevails in Polish society. We do understand how important Ukraine is for Poland, and how much our fate is, tied.
So the legacy of Jerzy Giedroyc should be unbroken. I think
Absolutely, and I was really enthusiastic when I heard during one of the last international speeches of your president Volodymyr Zelensky when he mentioned the name of Jerzy Giedroyc, because I believe Jerzy Giedroyc did it right.
Yeah, absolutely.
He saw it right. He saw how things should look like here.
And he did a lot for Ukraine. Actually, Kultura, the magazine that he was publishing in Paris, did a lot of things for Ukraine. For example, the discovery of this generation of exterminated writers that we call executed Renaissance. It was published by Yuri Lavrinenko, I think in the 1960s, under the aegis of Kultura. But I think the very concept of executed Renaissance, Rozstreljane Відродження, comes from Giedroyc.
Let me return now again to, you said a couple of things about the ethos, which is common to us, about the Ukrainian ethos more specifically. But I would like, as a matter of some kind of iteration, return to that topic in a kind of a philosophical, political sense. So Ukraine from the beginning, and that was also a part of a very interesting mixture of Ukrainian element and Polish element in my view. So Ukraine from its very beginning constituted itself as if in opposition to and in a struggle with some external political bodies or political forces, as a republic, as a kind of military democracy, simply speaking, a form of republic. What were, in your view, the psychological, cultural, philosophical, philosophically expressed origins of that? And more importantly, how does it affect Ukraine today? And even more importantly, do you see any changes now in times of this extremely brutal war of that ethos?
So I think you cannot understand Ukrainian resistance without this idea of grassroots democracy and self-organization. And Ukrainians were in effect, in a way, prepared. You cannot say prepared for the invasion, but this preparation was made. You never prepared for war, of course, but the way how Ukrainians resist can be explained by this experience of self-organization that happened during the Euromaidan and that happened during the Orange Revolution. But you cannot explain this without going deeper into tradition. For example, I remember one of the inscriptions on Maidan, which was like, in any unknown situation, build a siege, meaning this Cossack city in which you will protect yourself. So I think this kind of this reaction, I would call it even an instinct of self-organization, is really present, and I think you can really go deep and understand that Ukrainian current struggle is important without this the struggle during the first Ukrainian independence of the 20th century. And this you cannot understand without the Ukrainian literature like Taras Shevchenko and all the rest. And this you cannot understand without uprisings of the 18th century. And this you cannot understand without the Cossacks. And the Cossacks you cannot understand without this very plural political culture that we had during the medieval times, etc., etc. And you can go deep and deep and deep in history, even to this Cucut and Tripilla culture, because 6,000 years ago, because archaeologists say that these were the first mega sites or proto-cities in which there was no administrative buildings. And therefore there was no power, clear power structures. And the question that archaeologists are now posing is how in these mega sites that existed in the current central Ukraine, how like 10,000 people who were living there were organizing themselves without really hierarchy. So you can go as deep there without saying that everything was predestined, of course. But you can ask. I think you can ask this question of this self-organization. But at the same time, I think also the influence of Rzeczpospolita was very important. And I always say that, look, before we got caught into this Russian tyrannical statehood, we were in very republican environments. And you can be critical of Rzeczpospolita. I mean, the first
There are many reasons for that.
because you can say it was oligarchic republic, but still it was a republic, where the role of aristocracy and pluralistic aristocracy was strong, and therefore tyranny was not happening, and the king was not a tyrant compared to the Muscovy and then to the Russian Empire. You can say that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is also a very important part of our common history with Lithuanians and Belarusians, it's also several centuries, starting from the 14th century up until probably 15th century and later. Or you can say that the Rus, medieval Rus, was also very plural because it was not an empire, centralized empire. You have the amalgam of city-states like Kyiv, Chernihiv, Pereyaslav, and others, just like in Germany or in Italy at that time, So it's actually has deep roots, this republican spirit.
Do you see any changes in this ethos during the wartime?
No, I don't
It's
actually
just
see
another
it.
articulation of the.
Obviously, I mean, we have some problems with democratic institutions. Why? Because I would not say that Ukrainian parliament is strong during the war. I would not say that Ukrainian government, cabinet of ministers, is strong. I think there are signs of a little bit of monopolizing power of the office of the president, of Zelensky and his entourage. But I don't think it leads us directly to a kind of authoritarian regime, because people tolerate this centralization of power because of the war. People understand that if we have ideal democratic plurality, we would be probably caught in these quarrels and I mean look at the way how democracies during peacetime now really struggle with being efficient because of continuous democratic crisis. In France, or I don't know, in Britain or some other country, in America, obviously. So I think people kind of tolerate it, but will not tolerate if it breaks certain limits. And what we've seen from these protests when there was this attack on anti-corruption institutions. But at the same time, the army is very interesting because I very often go to the front line and talk with soldiers, and sometimes I have this feeling that the army is very plural. And sometimes I have a feeling, talking with Ukrainian soldiers, that they kind of Russians, for them, is just enemy. So their task is to fight against enemy. They don't have any particular feeling about them. They know that they need to protect against this enemy. But they hate the unions which are on the left and on the right. They think, these are bastards. These don't know how to make war. All these are, or they hate the police, which is on the checkpoints and stops them. So it's this internal, maybe a Cossack and anarchic spirit, which still doesn't denigrate into kind of into chaos, but it's that maybe creative anarchy that was always a characteristic of Ukraine. Anarchy, I don't mean by anarchy the absence of power. I mean the absence of a clear center of power, right?
So it's a power, decentralized power.
Yeah, I would even call it poly-archy, meaning the plurality of these power centers.
Okay, let me pose the last question, because in our attempts here in European Center for Philosophy of Culture, especially me myself as a founder, are working at certain reconceptualization of Eastern Europe. I mentioned that at the beginning of our conversation, and part of that reconceptualization is to start thinking about Eastern Europe in a more positive terms than before. That means to liberate ourselves or to emancipate ourselves from the post-colonialist, let's call it in this way, Western discourses. But another part is also to slightly rewrite the map or redraw the map of Eastern Europe, in a sense that we no longer consider Russia to be a part of Europe at all. So that means that Eastern Europe would be like the eastern border of Europe itself, which is to say that it is constituted by the countries which have Russia as a neighbor. Would you agree with this diagnosis that Russia simply does not fulfill the cultural patterns to be included into European community? I mean, in transhistorical perspective.
Well, Russia was identified with Eastern Europe in the 19th century by most of the Western Europeans, up to the point that when the Germans were starting their conservative revolution in the early 20th century, that later led to Nazism, they were actually considering Serbia as not part of the West, as part of something else. And you can imagine what Russian imperialism considered itself. And Poland was part of this, and Finland was part of this, and the Baltic states was part of this. I mean, this Russian Empire, which was identified with Eastern Europe, and of course Ukraine was part of this. So you can read the 20th century as a gradual, enlargement of the European idea, as a gradual retreat of this Russian tyranny, and basically Russia always tried to regain and make a revenge. So the Second World War is the revenge, in a way, for losing Poland, for the Russian Empire. And as the 20th century, for me, the biggest question of our region is whether Poland will maintain its independence that you fought for and you won after this First World War. So we know that you lost your independence during the Second World War, then you kind of regained it, but not fully during the socialist times, and then you regained it fully after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Berlin Wall. So the question whether Ukraine will regain its independence is the key question of the 21st century. And we can have this back and forth because Russia understands that if it loses Ukraine, it loses it loses the heart of its empire. Therefore, it's so painful for this. But at the same time, the idea of Eastern Europe should have been the idea of a Europe that has never been empire. And I wrote once an essay which is called Europe's Internal Decolonization, in which I argued that, look, the Western Europe was mostly the former empires, and therefore they have this burden of the imperialization of the world. And they are struggling with this very, very much because in France, in Britain, in Italy, in Spain, you increasingly see the discourse that we wanted to be the best in the 19th century. Now we are the worst because of our imperial past. Well, I think that Eastern Europeans can say, but look, Europe has not only been imperial, but it was it has been the victim of imperialism. It has been the victim of colonization, and therefore it has this potential of reviving Europe. Another thing which Eastern Europe is very strong is that the idea of Europe that Eastern Europeans have is not just the idea of this idyllic peace. We know that we need to protect this peace and we need to protect freedom. And basically, okay, today we talked about Jerzy Giedroyc and Maruszewski and this whole idea that we need to think about a new Europe and a new federation of states. But it also comes from the Central Europe. If you think about this first idea of Pan-Europa by Coudenhove-Kalergi, a great Austrian intellectual, who was very Central and Eastern European when he thought about the need to a federation of states after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. Or you can say about these intellectual movements in Slovakia, in Czech Republic, in Poland, in Ukraine in the 19th century that created this idea together with Italians, for example, created this idea that we need nation states, but also federation of the nation states. Unfortunately, now the Eastern Europe is very going into the wrong direction. When we look at Hungary, Slovakia, now we see the results of the Czech Republic voting, and I see that in Poland also there are different trends. And I'm very worried that we have this tragedy of Central Europe described by Milan Kundera turning into the comedy of Central Europe, where basically tragical comedy of Central Europe, where, as you remember, Kundera was describing Central Europe as kidnapped West. So formally in the East, but inside in the West, what we are having right now in some of the countries is kidnapped East, when people are formally in the West, but people are, nostalgizing about this being part of this tyrannical empire. So I hope that citizens of these countries, I understand that this is, of course, the battle of the future. So it's only part of the citizens thinking like that. But I would really love the Central and Eastern Europe to regain this basic idea that we are the countries that were not empires, and we don't want to imperialize any others. We want really to be kind of in a family of nations. And therefore we need to protect ourselves against this Russian tyranny or any other tyranny which wants to subjugate it, and it doesn't, in which wants imperialism and not this family of nations.
Well, you mentioned Kundera's essay. I have a double problem with this essay. The first one is that, in my view, it is based on some kind of naive belief in the power of Western culture, because Kundera himself admits by the end of this essay that, well, there is no authority to which I can refer my cries. Yeah. On the other hand, or another problem I have with this essay is that I don't like his cultural geography.
Yeah, me neither.
Because there is no place for Ukraine or even for Baltic republics
Absolutely.
in that geography.
I wrote about it back in 2014. I have this essay, Dreams of Europe. But I think he made a very good point. Of course, there are mistakes probably that we need to criticize. But I'm just really worried that this whole beautiful idea of Central and Eastern Europe that he had, maximum diversity on minimum space,
yes,
we're now losing it, or probably we lost it, and we need to regain it.
Yes, I fully agree. And I think it's an excellent point of arrival of our conversation. Volodymyr, thank you very much for your conversation, and thank you very much for all of your people for what you are doing, because I believe, and most of us believe, that you are sacrificing yourselves in defense not only of your country, but also of our world. So thank you very much, and please pass on our thanks to your people.
Thank you, Przemek, and thank you for your solidarity. It's very important for us.
Thank you.